Good morning. So good to be with you all on this Lord's Day morning. So growing up, I moved when I was in high school to Kauai and living on Hawaii in the islands of Hawaii. I'm not bragging. Living in Hawaii, a lot of people do a lot of surfing and bodyboarding. And I did probably just enough to get a few sermon illustrations out of it. And so one time I was surfing. I was probably in some bigger waves than I should have been in. And I wiped out, and I was lost in the wash, and I was tumbling, and I have this memory of this amazing, strange sense of disorientation as I'm just tumbling. And they say, don't even try to fight it. Don't try to swim up because you don't know which way is up. Are you going to go swim down, swim up? What are you going to do? And as you're tumbling, eventually you come kind of on your hands and knees to the sand and you just wash up. And you can stand up and you can feel the waves coming in and going out. You can feel that constant change, even the force of it, but you can also feel the sand between your toes and the ground and the gravity holding you under it. And there's lots of lessons in that, I think. There's probably a lesson in surrender as we are tumbling through the wash. But there's also this lesson about the gift in the turbulence, in the storm, as we sang about in the Lord's Supper, in the sea billows that are rolling, to have this gift of firm ground underneath us. To have the sense that you're standing on something that you know, something that can stabilize you. So let me skip to another thing that happened while I was in high school, and then we'll come back around and hopefully this connects. I remember in April of 1995, so I was a senior in high school, when the Oklahoma City bombing occurred, the federal building in Oklahoma City. And I have this memory of watching the news as people were interviewed. They would interview the first responders, and then they interviewed a lot of the different families who were mourning the loss of loved ones in this tragedy. And I remember this, I can see this guy's face. I remember this one man who happened to be a gospel preacher at a Church of Christ in Oklahoma City, and his wife had been killed in this incident. And he talked about the loss and how devastating it was. And the news anchor asked him, has this shaken your faith? And he said, my faith is based in the historical fact of the resurrection of Jesus. And this tragedy has shaken us all, but it doesn't affect the truth of Jesus' resurrection. He knew who his God was. He knew what God had done to show him who he was, to save him. And you know what he was doing right then? In that moment? He was giving what Peter calls a ready answer or a prepared defense. Peter says in our text that we looked at last week, 1 Peter 3:13-14, now who is there to harm you if you are zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you will be blessed. Have no fear of them, nor be troubled. But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect. Having a good conscience, so that when you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. To give a prepared defense, to give a ready answer to those who ask us, why aren't you shaken by this? Why are you hopeful? Why are you confident? Have you ever thought about what, at the very, very, very core, is your reason for hope? The reason for the hope that is within you? What do you think Peter had in mind when he spoke about giving a defense of the reason for the hope that's in you? What was Peter's reason for his hope? He who walked with Jesus, who saw many signs. Turn with me back a couple chapters to 1 Peter 1 as Peter starts his book, and let's kind of work backwards from verse 8. Verse 8, he says, though you haven't seen him, you love him. Though you don't see him now, you believe in him and you rejoice with this joy that's inexpressible. And then he talks about in verses 6 and 7 this trial that's on you. And even though everything is difficult and everything is challenging and things are getting harder all the time, yet you hold on to this faith and this inexpressible joy and this hope. Why is that? In verse 4, he says, you have an inheritance that's never going away. It's undefiled, it's unfading, it's kept in heaven for you. He calls this a living hope, a hope that didn't die, that isn't static. It's the same thriving hope we have today that they had 2,000 years ago. And look at what he says. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through what? What gives you living hope? What is the reason you have a living hope? Through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. That's the reason for our hope. That's the reason I can sing that song we just sang about holding Ruth, holding a newborn baby, and knowing this child can face uncertain days because he lives. I'm not going to tell you that I'm jumping headfirst with excitement to die. Maybe that's a level of maturity I haven't reached yet. But I'll tell you, I'm not afraid of it. I'll tell you that I know some things in my heart that give me sand under my feet when the storms come in. And it changes everything. And I want that for everybody I know. Don't you? Yes. Thank you, Evie. Me too. And so we try to have ready answers to explain it. And we don't need big, complicated things. We can just turn to that passage that Jake read for us. 1 Corinthians 15. The most important document about the resurrection you're going to find anywhere. And you can tell someone, just imagine that you don't believe that this is inspired from God. Just view this as an ancient document if you want. And know that virtually universally scholars see this, 1 Corinthians 15, you can read it for yourself and see that this verses 3 down through verse 8 is a confession, is a statement that Paul said, I received, that was handed down to me, that had very early origins. 1 Corinthians probably written in the 50s, 54, 55. But that statement was probably from the 30s, just years after Jesus rose from the dead. This statement, I love it. My kids are giving me amens over here. This statement is fundamental. That's why Paul says, this is the gospel that you believed. I delivered to you as of first importance, verse 3 of 1 Corinthians 15, what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and then he appeared to Cephas. Notice that word Cephas. It's using the Aramaic form of Peter's name. Very early origin. Why would they do that? Because of its early origins in this Aramaic-speaking community. To Cephas, and then to the 12. And then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Why would he say most of whom are still alive? As in, go ask them yourself. Go talk to them. I mean, we're so far removed, it's hard to think of it. Maybe this could be legend, like the King Arthur thing that got crazy. This is at the time that these people are around. These are in the very small communities that these things are happening in. All of this happens in Jerusalem. And he says, then he appeared to James. That's James, the brother of Jesus, the one who didn't believe in Jesus during his life, during Jesus' life, as the Gospels attest to. And then to all the apostles, and later, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. Saul, the great persecutor, converted. Why would he? Well, he believed, he stated, he said, it's because he saw Jesus. And why is there an emphasis? I get why the crucifixion of Jesus is emphasized according to the Scriptures, as in, look back and see how this was talked about. Read Isaiah 53, read Psalm 22. I get why the resurrection is talked about, but why in between the two is there this emphasis on burial in this core statement of faith? I submit to you that that's another evidence. Because if he was buried, what happened to the body? So this is what I want to look at. And like I said, if all you remember is just take somebody to 1 Corinthians 15, that's a good starting place. And this series, we'll dip into it several more times. I'm going to try to just give simple answers for you that you can give to somebody else. And everybody has different answers for these questions. At some level, there's different pieces of it that mean something to you, and you can share those things. But I think this is a really helpful core and fundamental answer, because this is what the New Testament church kept going back to as the fundamental reason for their faith, which is just crazy. Because in any other religion, I mean, most of theology, the test of whether to believe something or not is, does it make sense to you? Do you like what it says? Does it intuitively feel right? No Buddhist is saying to you, I need some historical occurrence to have occurred and be able to prove that in order for me to be Buddhist. They're saying, I think there's these really good Buddhist facts that I like, But the gospel is built on history. Not just on does it work, it does work. But did it happen? The claim, what Paul says over and over again in his sermons is, listen guys, listen. Something has happened and it changed everything. Jesus rose from the dead. Read through the sermons in Acts and their testimony about this. So when somebody asks you questions like, how can you hold on to your faith at a time like this? Or aren't all religions basically the same? Or how can I have confidence in death? What makes you so sure the God of the Bible is real? Why do you believe in Jesus? I suggest a simple answer. have you ever considered the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus? Have you ever thought about that? And not everybody will be convinced. We're not trying to strong arm anybody. We're just trying to give the information of the gospel. And the gospel has this power in it. Because, for one thing, it doesn't just speak to one part of us. These facts speak to our intellect, where we can examine evidence and weigh it and say, what is the most probable explanation of the facts? And also, this story about this seemingly nobody who came and lived with grace and mercy and then was killed and then rose again and did all of this for us and now reigns over a different kind of upside-down kingdom, that speaks to our hearts. It changes people. This is what happened, again, all through Acts. What you see is people, something happening to the way they think. There's this change that they have when they hear and decide to believe the gospel. I'm not saying it's magic. I'm saying this is what these ideas do to us. This is what this story does to us. It doesn't just give us hope for the future. It changes how we live now, how we see everything, how we see ourselves, how we see our wives and our husbands, how we see our enemies, how we do things. Everything is changed by this story. And it speaks to our will as we see this king that we decide to submit to surrender to, and to follow. So, in going back to a phrase from this is your antiquated movie reference / TV show reference of the sermon, going back to either the Dragnet movie of Tom Hanks and Dan Aykroyd maybe, or the show from way before that. There was these detectives that would say, just the facts, man. That's all I want. Just the facts. And I'm suggesting a just the facts approach. What if we just boiled down the case for the resurrection to just the most fundamental facts that all or nearly all historians and New Testament scholars and philosophers and theologians who are experts in these fields look at and say, whether from the whole range of theological beliefs, from an atheist to a skeptic to a believer, from an ultra-liberal to an ultra-conservative, everybody says, okay, we don't interpret the facts the same, but we believe these are the facts we have to interpret, right? And let's just think like historians for a minute, trying to interpret facts. So today, side illustration. Today, I brought up in our class, October 31st. This is the date, 500 years ago, that Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses on the wall, on the door. Why do you believe that Martin Luther existed? Why do you believe that he did that on October 31st, 1527, I think? Have you seen it with your eyes? Have you even seen video footage of it? Why do you buy into that? Well, because there are facts that we examine and we say, you know what? The most likely explanation for these, is that this guy actually existed and he actually did these things. Well, let's think in the same way about this. And I know the resurrection is different. This is an extraordinary claim that Jesus rose from the dead. It's not the same as somebody hung some piece of paper on a door. But God gives us extraordinary evidence for an extraordinary claim. And I wrote something about this that I'm going to send to you guys this afternoon. I'm not going to keep you here for an hour and a half to talk about on extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims. But we're just going to look at these facts and say, okay, what do most people, most most credible people, most experts in this particular field of ancient history and New Testament historians and scholars that look at this, what do they all agree on? And so this comes from a study that Gary Habermas did, a survey of 1,400 works on the resurrection by scholars of every ideology. Again, ultra-liberal, ultra-conservative, believers, not believers, all over the place. And so he came up with a bunch of different facts that they all, or almost all, agree on. And so of these, I pulled out 12. And I'm not expecting you to remember all these 12. But we're going to go through these 12 for you guys, and then I'm suggesting that you keep in mind 3 or 4 of these whenever you talk to people, and they're the ones that are found in 1 Corinthians 15. You can just go there. Basic facts. Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. Every once in a while you hear somebody say, we don't even know if Jesus died by crucifixion or something like that. This fact is supported by non-Christian Jewish historian Josephus. He said, when Pilate, upon hearing the accused by men of the highest standing among us, had condemned him to be crucified. Also attested to by non-Christian Roman historian Tacitus, non-Christian Greek satirist Lucian of Samosata, and also the Jewish Talmud. And it's just something more than even that, looking at what has happened in history and at these documents as prime documents in the New Testament. This is a fact that's really not questioned by anybody. Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. But that's important when we're talking about the resurrection. And that he was buried, most likely in a private tomb. And we have this story, this account in the Gospels of the honorable burial of Jesus in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And there's this account of that. And that certainly seems to be a credible account, and certainly that he was buried. And that soon afterward, the disciples were discouraged and bereaved and despondent, having lost hope. And that Jesus' tomb was found empty very soon after his interment. And the disciples had experiences that they believed were actual appearances of the risen Jesus. Now, not everybody would say they were appearances of the actual of Jesus, but most people, almost all of these experts, almost universally believed that the disciples had experiences that they believed were actual appearances of the risen Jesus, because their actions and their writings and their beliefs and their martyr's death don't make much sense without that. Whoops. And that due to these experiences, the disciples' lives were thoroughly transformed. They were even willing to die for their belief. And that the proclamation of the resurrection took place very early, from the beginning of church history. That the disciples' public testimony and preaching of the resurrection took place in the city of Jerusalem, where Jesus had been crucified and buried shortly before. Again, these things are not happening in a corner. These things are happening in this same area. The movement begins right next to the tomb, right? All of this is happening right next to these things that are being claimed happened. Okay, so then number 9, the gospel message centered on the preaching of the death and resurrection of Jesus. That Sunday was the primary day for gathering and worshiping. Significant, because where did that come from? These are Jews who held the Sabbath to be sacred. And now all of a sudden it's the first day of the week and not the last day of the week. What could account for such a claim? And the testimony of the New Testament is Jesus rose from the dead on the first day of the week. That is good circumstantial evidence. As, by the way, I don't think I have this up here, is baptism, this immersion, burial, and resurrection symbol that the preaching of the gospel brings, circumstantial evidence for the resurrection. And that James, the brother of Jesus, who was a skeptic before the time, was converted when he believed. He also saw the risen Jesus. And finally, just a few years later, Saul of Tarsus, Paul, became a Christian believer due to an experience that he also believed was an appearance of the risen Jesus. So I'm working on a format for giving you guys all of these lessons on ready answers that we're pulling together. So you'll have these notes, but more importantly, the short answer in either a card or a booklet or something. But just focusing in on these 5 facts: that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion and the appearances. Let's focus on these. First of all, the fact that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. We just talked about the evidences for that. Secondly, the fact that the disciples experienced these resurrection appearances. So 2 important facts about this. First of all is that they claimed that they saw him. And secondly, that they believed it. We just read in 1 Corinthians 15 this claim. We see this elsewhere. Paul knew these men that he talks about in 1 Corinthians 15. Galatians 2 talks about him going. No one disagrees that Paul wrote Galatians. It would be a strange thing for him to give this story about him going and receiving the right hand of fellowship from them if he didn't know them. So he knew these men. And he says that they claimed this all their lives. This is what they believed. These experiences where they touched Jesus, where they ate with Jesus. According to this statement, and the 4 Gospels, the sermon summaries in Acts, the writings of Clement of Rome in AD 95 or thereabouts, and of Polycarp, who was a student of John the Apostle in AD 110, also attest to these claims. And I'll also note their belief is shown by this transformation from running and denying Jesus at death to preaching the resurrection at the expense of their own lives. Their willingness to be martyrs, again, is attested to by Luke, by Clement of Rome, Ignatius, Polycarp, Dionysius of Corinth, Tertullian, and Origen. And so this is evidence that they had a sincere belief. These were men of moral character who threw everything on this belief. They didn't get rich from it. They didn't get famous in the way you want to get famous. They received nothing and lost much from this worldly standpoint. So let's talk about the genuineness of Paul's conversion, which he himself talks about in 1 Corinthians 15 and in Galatians 1 and in Acts 9 and 22 and 26. His suffering and his death are unquestioned. Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Tertullian, again, Dionysius, all of these, Origen, as well as Paul and Luke's own accounts, all talk about his suffering. 2 Corinthians 11 gives this extended account of his suffering. So what can explain this change in Paul other than this testimony being true, that he actually saw Jesus risen from the dead on that road? And then the conversion of the skeptic brother of Jesus. Mark 3:21 and 31 and 6:3 through 4 and John 7:5 talk about him as a skeptic. After Jesus' death, Paul and Luke identified James as a leader in the church in Galatians 1:19 and Acts 15:12 to 21. He's a pillar, right? He's this important figure. James is spoken of by Josephus. James, the brother of Jesus, is spoken of by Josephus. His martyrdom is attested to. Hegesippus and Clement of Alexandria all attest to the suffering and martyrdom of James for this belief. Again, what explains this change? You don't have to believe in Jesus risen from the dead if you don't want to, but find a way to deal with the evidence if this seems like an important question to you. And so then I have one bonus fact for you, and that is the empty tomb. This is not universally agreed, but about 70% of scholars agree on that the tomb actually was empty for whatever reason. And some of the evidence is, first of all, the Jerusalem factor that we talked about, that all of this is happening in Jerusalem. The enemy attestation, Matthew 28, verses 12 and 13, where you see this explanation of an apology, a defense of, no, the guards were told, they were paid to say that we took the body. That didn't really happen. They were just paid to say that. Why do you explain away that if there wasn't somebody claiming it? And why would anybody be claiming it if the tomb wasn't empty? Justin Martyr and Tertullian also talk about this enemy attestation to the empty tomb. And then the testimony of women. Okay, this is where I don't want women to throw any tomatoes at me. I'm the messenger. This is a quote. Josephus said, "Let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex." This is just the belief of Jews in that time, generally. The Talmud said, any evidence which a woman gives is not valid. It's the same, they should have the same regard as a robber. So if you're going to concoct a story with, I know. The guys are the ones that are like, he's really brave up there quoting these sources. So you're going to make up a story, right? You're going to say, okay, let's come up with a really convincing case for how the empty tomb is found. Maybe you come up with Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, these two wealthy rulers that are respected. But no, it's these women. These women who already know Jesus. The testimony across the Gospels is that the women find the tomb and they go running back, and it doesn't really paint them in any light except as those who see it first. They're bringing, they're going to care for this person they love. They see it first and they run back to tell everybody. Oxford University historian William Wand writes, all the strictly historical evidence we have is in favor of the empty tomb, and those scholars who reject it ought to recognize that they do so on some other ground than that of scientific history. And a lot of historians and scholars would say, yeah, I do. Because they might say, I don't believe in these supernatural things. I don't believe, they might even, be disparaging. I don't believe in magic, I believe there has to be some other kind of an answer for it. So I guess that's the question. Do you want to come up with some answer that is really, really hard to believe and improbable, but doesn't require any supernatural explanation? Or do you want to come to the most natural conclusion and accept that it is possible for something supernatural to happen? So when somebody asks you, why should I believe in Jesus? I suggest this. Have you ever considered the facts supporting Jesus' resurrection? That Jesus was crucified and buried, and afterwards his disciples believed, they saw him, and most agree also that his tomb was found empty. Have you ever considered that? What do you think is the best explanation of that? And I've read places where people talk about aliens taking the body of Jesus and some other appearance of Jesus as an alien. I've read, certainly other more reasoned examples. Some people think there was some kind of a vision or something that they were having. There's people wrestle with this who don't believe. But it is such a strong case, and God has given us enough evidence to decide to believe. Not enough evidence to prove so that you are forced to believe it. Enough evidence to convince if you're willing to consider it honestly. And you have to decide what you believe. Never has nothing meant so much as that empty tomb and the Jesus, the Savior, who left it after he died, raising again. We can say it can't be that because there is no supernatural force. But we find in this one evidence, or this one basic fundamental belief of Christianity supported by this evidence, that not only is Jesus who he claimed to be, but if Jesus is who he claimed to be, then we understand who God is. And if we understand who Jesus is, we also understand what the scriptures are, because we know what Jesus believed about the scriptures. And so we take from this one fact the whole case that can be made from Christianity. I know there are many other things we could look at, but I find this to be a powerful evidence. As you go to those that you love, as you share this with them, as they ask you, be loving, listen well. Whenever people try to take you away from the topic, stay on point. People will say, okay, that evidence is good, but what about suffering? Or what about this? Or what about that? The Bible's full of so many inconsistencies. Yeah, I'd love to talk to you about that. But what do you think about this evidence? What do you think about the resurrection of Jesus? And pray for them. Pray for yourself. Pray that we might be effective as we speak the gospel to others. This living hope is available to all of us. We, like Jesus, can die to ourselves and be buried in the waters of baptism and raise to a new life and then live forever through his resurrection. We invite you to come if you're ready to be